The most vivid memory I have of my end is a cold and colorless hospital room, the constant hum of machines, and the hurried footsteps of doctors and nurses, were all I could hear as my heart seemed to skip beats. I was scared but also exhausted, bearing that pain had become unbearable. After sudden silence, I remember a sudden break, as if someone had pressed the pause button on everything around me. No sound, no suffering, just a muffled emptiness that rocked me gently. It was a strange sensation. The strangest I had ever felt. I felt as if I was leaving my body, but at the same time I felt more myself than ever. In that silence I perceived such an absence of weight. There was no pain or fear anymore. It was then that I saw the light, not just any light but something alive, almost pulsating. It seemed to radiate the purest warmth and love. From that light a figure emerged, Jesus. At that moment I didn't even know him. I happened to wonder how it was possible I recognized him. Although his face was enveloped in an infinite glow, his voice resonated within me, as if he had always been there. Come with me, I will show you what happens to souls who reject my salvation. I did not hesitate. I felt neither fear nor doubt, only a deep desire to follow him, and in that instant the light around us changed. I found myself in a vortex of darkness, as if the earth had opened beneath my feet. A cold wind whipped my face. I barely had time to grab Jesus' hand and then my journey began. I found myself in a place that seemed the opposite of the paradise that I had just glimpsed. The smell was the first thing that hit me, an unbearable stench, a mixture of burnt flesh, decaying and sulfur. I tried to cover my nose but it seemed to seep through every pore of my skin. The light of before had disappeared, replaced by a suffocating darkness, yet in a way inexplicable. Yet I could see. I noticed expanses of black rocks, caves that expelled flames, and from every corner I heard heart-rending screams that shook my soul. I felt as if I were walking on a living floor, throbbing beneath our feet like trembling flesh tormented by terror. I clung to the hand of Jesus, my only salvation in that chaos. His touch was firm, comforting from time to time. My gaze fixed on him, fearing that he could disappear, but he was there, and that was enough to keep me from losing my sanity. Where are we? I asked with a trembling voice. We are in hell, he answered with deep sadness. I could not breathe. Hell. All my life I had heard of this place, but I never imagined that I would cross its threshold. A feeling of horror overwhelmed me, mixed with an inexplicable compassion for the voices that suffered around me. We continued walking, and with each step I seemed to feel the weight of an eternity of suffering settling on my shoulders. The screams grew in intensity, as if the very walls of that cursed place were whispering curses in my ears. I was defenseless, but strangely more alive than I had ever felt before. As we passed under a blackened stone arch, we came upon a vast fiery plain. It was a sea of ashes lit by flames that sprang from the ground like wild geysers. Between these fires I saw souls naked, their skin taut and dry, wandering with terrified expressions. They seemed to be searching for something, sniffing the air and looking desperately around. Their seat was palpable, as if every fiber of their being craved a drop of water. I saw one of them bend down and try to drink from a dark pool of unknown liquid, but the next moment she convulsed in agony, as if that drink would only make her torment worse. Some ran with arms outstretched towards a mirage of fountains that dissolved the moment they tried to get closer. It was an endless torment, a perpetual chase for relief that would never come. The anguish on their faces went far beyond any physical suffering imaginable. Who are these people? He asked softly. Are they those who lived only to satisfy their own desires? Jesus answered in a tone full of compassion. They sought pleasure without ever being satiated, ignoring the only living water that could quench them. A woman approached us, so thin she looked like a skeleton, her hair as dry as straw. She stretched her hands towards me, her lips moving in a silent plea. I felt my heart clench like in a vice. I wanted to do something, give her some water, a hug, anything, but I was powerless. I felt a crushing empathy. How many times had I chased selfish desires, ignoring the true thirst of my soul? I was overwhelmed with gratitude and fear, realizing how easily I could have ended you instead. We left that plain of fire and continued down a narrow stone passage. The sound that greeted us on the other side was different, wailing, thin, small voices tearing through the air like the cry of a newborn. I felt my blood freeze. Jesus led me to a gigantic transparent cistern filled with small souls, twisted in constant anguish. They were countless, with the shapes of newborns, or almost formed fetuses. Some seemed only faint silhouettes, mere shadows, but they had crying voices that pierced the soul. "Mum, why did you kill me?" they shouted in chorus voices higher than any adult cry. It was as if each word carried the weight of violated innocence. I saw those small hands grabbing onto the walls of the cistern, searching for a grip that did not exist. From time to time a golden light and gently lifted some of those little ones, carrying them away. "Where are they going?" I asked with my throat tight, hoping it was going to a place of peace. "They come back to me," explained Jesus, "because their parents recognized their mistake and asked forgiveness and their repentance. But the others who were left behind were destined to languish in that eternal testimony of a life cut short, before they could even bloom." A massive weight settled on my heart. I realized their voices would never be silenced, proclaiming endlessly the injustice they had suffered. There was no anger in them, only pure and inconsolable pain. We delved into another rocky corridor that opened to a vast expanse of iron boilers, incandescent. The heat was oppressive and a smell of charred metal burned our eyes. Each boiler had a name or category engraved on it: Evangelical, Catholic, Orthodox, Pentecostal, pastors, priests. Inside those cauldrons there were men and women screaming while a boiling substance covered them like a molten tar. Their incessant screams filled the air. It was an agony renewed every second. I recognized the face of a famous preacher I had seen on television. "But I have heard him preach the truth," I protested incredulously. "He was so passionate, he really seemed devoted to God." Jesus looked at me sadly. He said the right words, but never his heart was turned to me. His deeds were done for vain glory, not for my love. In public he preached my word, but in private he lived in lies and scandals. He did not serve me but himself. I felt a chill inside that made me tremble despite the infernal heat. At that moment I understood the difference between a truly lived faith and a merely professed one. How much hypocrisy can be hidden behind a religious robe, behind a pulpit or an altar. My strength failed me, thinking how easily the human heart can fall when vanity prevails over sincerity. Leaving behind the cries of the boilers, we passed through a wider passage that seemed to descend into the bowels of the earth. The air became dense as if each breath were a struggle. Then we found ourselves before a huge expanse of black, viscous mud, a true lake of corruption. The souls of men and women of all ages and social classes were submerged up to their chests in that rotten filth, being continually dragged underwater by monstrous creatures that resembled reptiles with sharp claws. Some tried to get out, but the more they struggled the deeper they sank. "Who are they?" I asked Jesus with a barely audible voice. My stomach turned at their sight. Jesus said with a look full of infinite sadness, "They sold their souls for power, money and success. They tied their lives to earthly ambitions, forgetting charity, honesty and justice." Then I saw a familiar face, a man who I knew was still alive on earth. He was a well-known cop with whom I had worked closely. "How is it possible that he is still alive?" I screamed, horrified. "His body walks the earth," Jesus explained, "but his soul is already enslaved here. The demon that he welcomed into his heart now uses his body like a puppet. His true self is imprisoned in this mud." I felt weak. A terrible truth: there are soulless people living beside us, empty puppets in the hands of evil. I realized the dark complexity that can lurk behind the faces of those we meet each day. We continued until we reached a desolate valley covered in ash gray. Here there were no towering flames, only a continuous fire that coiled around the tongues of those souls in spirals fiery. I saw dozens of demons with iron pincers red hot, seizing tongues and tormenting souls. They spread slander, defamation, lies and gossip. Their words, instead of edifying, destroyed. My attention was attracted by an old woman, her hair once singed white. When she looked up I was horrified to recognize her as my grandmother. I had always considered her a devout woman. She went to church every Sunday and prayed constantly. "I don't understand," I stammered with tears burning my eyes. "She prayed all the time. She was devout." "The problem is not religion but the heart," Jesus said, with infinite sweetness and firmness. Her mouth was full of malice and judgment towards others. She spoke of me but she never knew me. Truly she used prayer as a shield while his heart harbored envy and constant criticism. I became inconsolable. I wanted to scream and defend her but I realized I could do nothing. The time to ask for forgiveness and change her life is on earth, not here. What I was seeing was the tragic consequence of her poisonous words never announced. We passed through a stone portal covered in demonic carvings, and we found ourselves in a dark cave where the air was cold and still. There were no flames or screams, only a heavy silence that oppressed my heart. I felt as if the light itself had been shut out of that place. I can see nothing, I whispered, feeling anxiety rising. Who is here? Those who denied me, Jesus answered with melancholy in his voice. They chose to live as if I did not exist. They rejected my light and now they live in eternal darkness. I approached trying to see something in the darkness. I perceived hunched silhouettes, motionless without expression. They did not scream or cry. They seemed like empty shells wrapped in a total apathy. A deep horror invaded me. It was as if they were enveloped by an absolute nothingness, incapable even of feeling pain. At that moment I understood how the absence of any hope can be more devastating than any physical torment. There was no comfort or light, not even the slightest perspective of an exit. It was the annihilation of all feeling. The inner darkness. I gathered my courage, grabbing Jesus's hand in gratitude for still having a spark of life in me. As we emerged from that terrifying darkness we found ourselves in a narrow passage. The walls seemed to have been scratched by inhuman nails, and from some cracks clotted blood dripped. Each step echoed, multiplying the fear. Suddenly I heard a muffled voice. "You can see me." I turned and saw a man sitting on the ground, hunched against the rock. His skin was completely burned in dark patches, as if it was charred. His eyes seemed empty but they conveyed an indescribable smell. "Who are you?" I asked, taking a hesitant step towards him. "I have been here for 290 years," he replied with a trembling voice. "The fire never leaves me, not even for a single instant. Every second is like burning me for the first time." Upon hearing this soul I was frozen. How can he be in this place 290 years? I could barely comprehend such a period of time in torment. Finally I gathered the courage to ask him, "Why are you here?" He lowered his head as if he was ashamed. "I lived for money, for luxury. I thought God was a foolish invention. I mocked anyone who had faith. I believed I could buy anything and now I was burning." No trace of arrogance remained in his voice, only a regret. Desperate, "If only I could go back just for a moment." His words dissolved into a bland remain clear. He clung to any chance of redemption but his time had long gone. Jesus watched him with deep sadness. "Grace was within your reach but you threw it away." The man began to sob again, long dried tears as if he was completely emptied. In that moment I understood the magnitude of despair for a soul condemned to endless torment. After that heartbreaking encounter the landscape changed once again. We found ourselves before a huge black door adorned with symbols that terrified me at first sight. Writhing snakes' skulls, grinning devilish inscriptions. When it opened a wave of hot, smelly air hit us. Inside was a hall as vast as an inverted cathedral. In the center a dark throne rose cold as a block of obsidian. A figure sat upon it, trapped in smoke and shadows that seemed alive. I could not clearly make out the face but I felt a presence intensely malevolent, a threat constant. Around him rows of demons knelt. Some held blood-stained scrolls, others dragged souls chained, twisted by fear and pain. One of them cried out in a hoarse voice, "Here is another soul for you, my lord." A nauseating disgust invaded me, as if my own spirit rebelled against that blasphemy. However, Jesus squeezed my hand firmly. I remembered that he was my protection, my only hope. The ruler of that abyss fixed his gaze on me. "So you have come this far, human." His voice was hissing, stealthy but brimming with boundless hatred. I felt fear flood my veins but Jesus spoke in my place. "She is not yours. I have already triumphed." For an instant a wave of fury swept the hall. The flames rose and the shadows seemed to shudder with rage. A roar shook the throne as if that declaration had made the very foundations of hell tremble. I closed my eyes and everything turned white. I opened my eyes suddenly as if I had been submerged in cold water. For a moment I couldn't understand where I was. Then I recognized the white ceiling, the neon lights, the incessant beeping of the hospital equipment. I felt disoriented, my heart was beating wildly. I saw the shocked faces of two nurses looking at me. Your heart had stopped stuttering, one of them still in disbelief. My legs felt like jelly, my hands were shaking, but it was a tremor full of life. I was back. I closed my eyes again briefly, and in an instant I relived everything I had seen. The boiling cauldrons, the desperate screams of the man burning for 290 years, Satan on his throne. Every detail was etched in my mind with a fiery clarity. I was in hell, I whispered in a weak voice. Tears of gratitude and terror ran down my face. I was alive, but that awareness carried with it an enormous responsibility. In its infinite mercy, Jesus had allowed me to return for one purpose only, to be a witness. The world needed to know what awaits those who reject their salvation. Time is short, and urgency burned in my chest like a holy fire. I knew some would call me crazy, others would mock me, but it didn't matter. My duty was to make known this truth, to save even one soul from that eternal horror. I would use my voice, my writing, any means possible to shout to the world, hell exists, salvation is real. Don't wait until it's too late. In the time that followed I recovered physically, but my life was never the same again. Not a day goes by that I don't remember those screams, those empty or frantic stares of lost souls. Every time I talk to someone I feel a deep surge of love. I don't want anyone to end up there. The certainty of hell is not a story meant to scare children or an abstract allegory. I have seen it, I have heard it, I have touched it with senses. Transformed by that mystical experience, I have understood that the mercy of Christ is the only shield we have against that endless horror. If you have read this story, know that you have a gift before you. Time still has the opportunity to choose the light and avoid the darkness. I was granted a second chance, but many will not have it.